Okay, here we go with our first set of video notes from the evolution unit. This one is going to be about the history of evolution and how evolution works through natural selection. Before we begin talking about evolution, though, we kind of have to figure out what evolution is. So, in the simplest sense, we can think of evolution as just a change in something over time, right? Everything changes. You guys change as you grow older. The city of Dallas has changed over the years. It's no longer the little town that it used to be. Different businesses come and grow, things like that. Biological evolution, basically the same thing. It's a change over time, but in this case, it's always going to be a change in population of organisms over time. So just a change in a population of organisms. And that'd be the really, really important part, though, that it's a population of organisms. The idea that organisms change over time is not really all that new. People have been talking about it for a long time. Actually, kind of goes all the way back to Aristotle, thought that things changed and tried to classify all forms of life. Some of the first kind of biological evolution as we know it, change in whole populations of organisms, was first advanced by this guy right here, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. So you can see when he lived, so this is going to be in the late 1700s, early 1800s that he's giving these ideas. And this guy hypothesized that acquired traits were passed on to offspring. So what the heck is an acquired trait? An acquired trait is something that you get in your lifetime, right? So you sort of work it up. And he was kind of famous for talking about these giraffes down here, right? And he would say that giraffes got their longer necks by stretching higher and higher and higher to reach the leaves in the upper parts of the trees, and eventually they would have longer and longer necks because they would stretch them out, and then they would pass these on to their kids, which seemed to make sense. Like, you can think of, you can change parts of your body, or you can kind of think of those tribes in Africa that literally stretch their necks with those rings. But the problem with that is there's no change to the DNA. So while, yes, you can acquire traits throughout your lifetime, you can change your body, you're not going to pass that on to your offspring because you're not changing your DNA at all. So ideas of evolution kind of persisted along the lines of Lamarck for a long time, until actually two guys started right around the same time. So one of these guys you've probably heard of, Charles Darwin, who's this guy right here, and then also another guy named Alfred Russel Wallace, who's pictured right here. And they had kind of some similar things in common. They both traveled all around the world. Darwin went to South America and the Galapagos Islands, most famously on the HMS Beagle. So you can kind of see his trip here. Started out in England, went all the way around South America. The principal job was for him to be on a ship that was mapping South America, but he was just a naturalist. The Royal Navy did that a lot. So he just kind of went out and collected animals and checked stuff out. There's Galapagos Islands, and he kind of went all over to lots of different places. Alfred Russel Wallace was kind of similar in that he was traveling all around the world. He went to South America as well, and he also spent time over here in the Philippines, the Malay Archipelago, we call it, different islands, checking out lots of different animals, seeing lots of differences in animals. Right? Both of them kind of came upon the idea of natural selection. They said that surviving individuals would pass their traits on to offspring. So the things that had the better traits, they lived longer, and they survived longer, and they had more offspring, and then they could pass those on. And kind of an interesting story is they both published at the same time. In fact, Darwin kind of came up with this idea earlier, but spent a long, long, long time trying to get a lot of evidence for this because he knew that he was sort of going up against the creationist idea at the time. So he spent a lot of time trying to get evidence, and then Wallace comes up with the idea on his own a little bit later than Darwin, like a couple decades later than Darwin, and didn't spend so much time trying to get his evidence, and basically came up with the same idea. They published them at the same time, but Darwin really gets most of the credit because he's the one who wrote his famous book on the origin of species in 1859. This is a very, very well-read book and very controversial, but this kind of got his name out there on the idea of evolution and natural selection. So, since natural selection and the theory of evolution is pretty much the most important thing in biology ever, it's probably a good idea that we come up with a good definition of natural selection and talk about how that works. So the mechanism for evolution is natural selection. Natural selection is what causes it to work. And basically, the idea is that organisms with more beneficial traits, so the things that are helpful, tend to pass these traits on to more offspring than those without the beneficial trait. And so that basically means is you got some advantage, so you survive for a lot longer, and that's important, but what's really important is that you reproduce more and pass those genes on to more kids, and so that eventually the population will have more of that trait as more offspring have been born having that trait. So if you kind of compare Lamarck to Darwin and think about the giraffes, Lamarck would have said, like we said earlier, that they just stretched and stretched and stretched and got longer necks and then passed those on to their kids. Well, Darwin would have said, no, there's lots of different size necks in giraffes out there, and the ones that had the slightly longer necks had a little bit more of an advantage because they could reach higher, so they got more food, they were happier, they lived longer, and they were healthier, whatever, so they had more kids than those with short necks that couldn't reach the leaves as well. So the long-necked giraffes tended to have more kids than the short-necked giraffes, so the next year's crop of giraffes would have had more longer necks, and that is how a population could change over time. And so just a final couple words on things that evolution is not. We always hear survival of the fittest, and that's a very good description of evolution, but it is not always about strength. Right? For example, can you think of anything that gets an advantage that has nothing to do with strength? Right? So think of something that maybe helps it reproduce better. So, for example, a peacock. Right? The male peacock with the prettiest tails, feathers, is the one who's going to get the mate. It doesn't necessarily have to be stronger than the other guy. It doesn't have to be the fastest gazelle out on the plain to outrun the lion sort of deal. He's just the prettiest, so he gets the most ladies, so he's going to pass his genes on more than the next guy. Or it could be about camouflage, right? If you're really, really blending in very well, you're not going to get eaten, and so you're going to live longer, so you might be able to reproduce longer. So in a genetic sense, or an evolutionary sense, fitness is an organism's genetic contribution to the next generation. So in an evolutionary sense, if you're a very fit organism, you are having more babies. Basically, you're passing your genes on more. So the one that's passing their genes on more, those are going to survive better in an evolutionary sense. Another thing we should talk about is organisms don't adapt, populations do. Right? So we don't talk about evolution in one organism, we talk about them in populations, because the composition of the population has to change. The proportion of giraffes with longer necks compared to giraffes with shorter necks changes. Right? So when you talk about adaptation, the population changes to survive better. Individuals do not just acquire good traits. Right? It's not just like, oh, hey, I'm going to take my dog, and he's a chocolate lab, and I'm going to drop him off on the North Pole, and since it's cold, he's going to grow a thick white coat. No, it doesn't work that way. Right? The population has to change over time. So with that, we'll conclude this section of our notes.